Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Well, hello and welcome back, everybody. This is your host, Pat Flynn, and today we are going to continue on with our discussion and development of the argument from contingency. So if you have not listened to part one of this foundational series of episodes where we are exploring the minimum effective apologetic, that is arguments for God's existence, arguments that Christ is God, and finally arguments that Christ founded the Catholic Church, we are, of course, currently working our way through natural theology or arguments for the existence of God, and even more specific than that, we are on the famous argument from contingency, part 2. And what I would like to do in this episode, it will be relatively brief, is give some support to the first premise. So in part 1, we gave a general overview of the argument, tried to help you understand what exactly the argument is attempting to prove, which is, of course, that in order to explain why there is something rather than nothing, there must be a sole necessary reality. In other words, within the totality of reality, there must be a reality that exists in and through itself. And by way of deduction, we can conclude that this necessary reality must be a timeless, spaceless, immaterial, extremely powerful personal intellect, which of course most of us would simply prefer to call God. And we do that through a series of premises or steps in the argument that to the extent you believe these premises are true, or at least more plausibly true than not, the conclusion follows inescapably. So I will quickly remind you of what the premises are, but if you haven't listened to that first episode, you absolutely must go back and listen to that first. Otherwise, you're just not going to fully understand everything we're talking about here. This is a cumulative project, so be sure to do the previous homework and assignments, even if that's just listening to the previous episodes. That way you can get the most out of this. So the argument in its syllogistic form goes like this. Step 1, everything that exists has an explanation for why it exists, either in a necessity of its own being or an external condition. Instead of condition, we might sometimes use the word cause. I prefer condition. That's premise 1. Premise 2, if the universe has an explanation for its existence, that explanation is God. Premise 3, the universe exists. And then it just follows deductively from there that God exists as the explanation for the universe. Now, I gave a brief defense of each premise in episode 1, but now I would like to dive a little bit deeper and look at premise 1 specifically, which is a modest presentation of what's known as the principle of sufficient reason. And I would say that the majority of the weight in terms of what makes this argument successful really hinges on the first premise and whether or not we believe that at least that modest version of the principle of sufficient reason is true. Because where the atheist will try to escape this argument or deny it is they won't say, at least I don't know of any serious contemporary atheistic philosopher these days who says this, they won't say that the universe is a necessary being, because there's absolutely no reason to think that the universe is a necessary being. Remember what we said before, anything that could have been otherwise, that could have been different than it is, could also not have been at all. And there's nothing about our universe as a whole or anything within the universe that is that type of that is the type of thing that a necessary being could be, whether it's the fundamental laws of the universe or the fundamental stuff, whatever you think that is, fermions or bosons or strings. None of that none of that has to be the way that it is. We can conceive of a universe operating according to very different laws and made of very different fundamental stuff. So there's nothing logically necessary about it. And anything that could have been otherwise could not have been at all, meaning it is contingent. And if the principle of sufficient reason is true, then any contingent thing requires an explanation for why it exists in an external condition. Now, this is where the argument starts to have a lot of tension, because if we concede that, And we also can see that the universe is contingent, that it is a caused cause, and that all caused causes must ultimately be explained by an uncaused cause or some type of external condition. Well, that's the end of atheism right there, because we have now broken beyond naturalism. We are now into supernaturalism, because we must go beyond the universe in order to explain the universe. But the universe just is all of space-time reality. So by working our way beyond space-time reality, by moving beyond nature to find an explanation for why all of nature exists, itself refutes naturalism. It shows that there must be something beyond nature. There must be a supernatural reality to serve as the necessary foundations for why anything exists rather than nothing. So atheists, like I said, typically, and in my experience, I've really never seen a serious atheistic philosopher, at least on the scene today, try and make the argument that the universe is a necessary being. Now, we will respond to that objection later in case it does come up, but rather where the atheist will try to get out of this argument or deny the argument is one of two ways, but we will focus primarily on the first. And that is, of course, by denying that the principle of sufficient reason is true. So they'll admit that the universe is contingent, but that once you get down to some fundamental aspect of the universe, perhaps the laws of nature, you arrive at what they would call a brute fact. It's something that just is and has no explanation. Okay, you just kind of throw your hands up. Now, you might be thinking that sounds sort of like a taxi cab fallacy, and I would be right there with you, where you assume that the principle of sufficient reason is true, and you ride it for as long as it's convenient for you, but then you get to, call it the edge of the universe, and then you abandon that principle arbitrarily. So that's the first problem with trying to deny the principle of sufficient reason or rest your case on the brute fact hypothesis, is it seems to be committing a fallacy of special pleading, or the taxi cab fallacy. Now, somebody might try and turn that around and say, well, aren't you doing the same thing with God? And the answer there is no. God is a necessary reality. So God is not without an explanation. God is that which exists through himself. He just is that which could not have not existed. Within him, he is an unrestricted act of understanding and intelligibility. He has within himself the answers for not only why he exists, but why everything else exists. And that actually gets us into a different line of argument, a famous argument made from the philosopher Bernard Lonergan. God is an unrestricted act of understanding. But it's very much similar to the contingency argument that we're working with here. So the brute fact is trying to really say that the principle of sufficient reason isn't true, because ultimately what it's saying is not everything has an explanation. We can just arrive suddenly at this point that is just there for no reason at all. Now, let's take a little bit of time to beef up this first premise and see why we should accept that the principle of sufficient reason, at least in the way that is presented in this argument, is true, or at least far, far more plausibly true than not. And remember, the standard for a good argument isn't that we need to run every premise with absolute certainty, because the truth is that very, very few things in life do we run with absolute certainty. The vast majority of the decisions we make and the things we hold to be true, we make those decisions and hold these things to be valid. We believe that they're more plausibly true than not. I go outside because I think that it's more plausibly true than not that I will not be suddenly abducted by aliens. All of my experience and the data we have leads me to that conclusion. And so I go outside. I also believe that it's far more plausibly true that all men are mortal, and since that I am also a man, therefore I am mortal as well. Now, it's certainly conceivable. It isn't logically impossible that I could step outside and suddenly be abducted by aliens. That could, in principle, happen. I just don't think it's very plausibly the case. It's also conceivable that we could one day discover an immortal man. But nobody, I think, is making any reasonable decisions based off of sheer conceivability. Rather, they're making informed decisions based off the best information we have, and coming to conclusions that are arrived at from premises they believe are more plausibly true than not. And I think that that is the right standard. I think that's the right expectation to have for what makes a good argument, right? And if we're going to say that we're not just trying to demonstrate God's existence, but show that God's existence is eminently reasonable, then that's the only standard we need, that this is a good argument. So what reasons do we have for thinking that the principle of sufficient reason is more plausibly true than not? Well, first is experience. Twofold. One is that when we look for explanations, we typically do find them. And when we don't find them, it's not like we don't think an explanation exists. We just think that we're missing some piece of evidence. So, for example, if we come across a murder scene, we very much expect that there's some type of explanation for why this person was killed. And even if we don't know who done it, we don't say, well, it's just a brute fact, sometime, and for no explanation at all. No, we would say we just don't have the requisite information or the evidence to firmly conclude who exactly committed this murder, if anybody. So the principle of sufficient reason is about as empirically sound as anything can possibly get. All of science presupposes it. Virtually all of philosophy presupposes it until it's abandoned more or less arbitrarily once it leads to the existence of God. And to the extent that we start to deny the principle of sufficient reason, this is getting into the second support, is it leads to a position of radical skepticism. As soon as we admit that things could happen for no explanation at all, well, then it becomes quite conceivable that our perceptual states and our thoughts and emotions are happening for no reason at all. But then we have no reason to believe that any of our perceptual states, thoughts, or emotions are true. They could just seem to be happening for good reason, but they might actually be falsely appearing to be happening for good reason. They might actually not have any good explanation for why they're happening, which then means we should be skeptical of all of our cognitive and perceptual states if things can really happen for no reason at all. But that means we should also be skeptical of the thought or belief that things can, of course, happen for no reason at all. So it's self-undermining. It's ultimately self-defeating in the sense that it leads to a radical point of skepticism if you really believe that things can just happen for no explanation at all, because it would apply to your own perceptual states, cognitive states of awareness, and so on and so forth. So, and that includes just all of your beliefs as well. So if you believe that all of your beliefs can happen without any explanation, then you should be skeptical of all of your beliefs, and therefore you should be skeptical of the belief that things can happen with no explanation. So it cannot even support itself. And it's silly, because all of us know that that's just ridiculous. So it's self-undermining to try and deny the principle of sufficient reason, which I think is always a powerful line of support. To the extent that somebody tries to escape an argument and it leads them to incoherency or radical skepticism, you've got a pretty good argument. You're working an argument off of basic first principles that, in order to reject them, causes a person to look very silly, causes them to look very insincere. And I think that that's what we have with the principle of sufficient reason. In order to reject this, you're just going to look a little bit insincere. It's going to look like you really are a case of special pleading or special exemption without any good reason why. Furthermore, if the principle of sufficient reason weren't true, we would probably expect the world to be behaving a lot differently than it is. If things can really just happen for no explanation at all, then why isn't a moose suddenly appearing in my attic right now? Why don't things just pop into being all the time, or at least even occasionally, if things can actually do that? If things can really happen with no external condition to explain them, no explanation required, then why don't they? Why don't they? And it's because the principle of sufficient reason is true. Anything that exists does have an explanation for why it exists, either in an external condition or a necessity of its own being. And finally, if you believe that that is true, then brute facts no longer become acceptable. You get to whatever the edge of the universe is, the edge of the universe is, the universe as a whole, you realize that it's still a cause, that it's contingent. Therefore, we cannot rest upon a brute fact. It must have an explanation in a necessary reality beyond itself. One more thing about the kind of brute fact thing, however, is there's another damaging conclusion that falls out of that, is if you think that you can rest all explanations on a brute fact, you have to realize that explanations are kind of like pregnancy. You either have explanations all the way, like you're either full of explanations, like you're actually pregnant, or you're not. You're not like half pregnant or a quarter pregnant. Here's what I mean by that. If you explain A in terms of B, and then B in terms of C, and then C in terms of a brute fact, well, you haven't explained A. You haven't given really any explanation at all. You're just saying that things really have no explanation, because every explanation before that was just an IOU. It was just an IOU. It was a borrowed explanation that really couldn't have been cached because it rests on a brute fact. So all explanations fall down with brute facts is what the ultimate conclusion there is that you have to reach. But that's silly, because we know that we have explanations for things, and it seems like the universe and that reality is actually intelligible. So we have all the reason to reject this idea of brute facts as a taxi cab fallacy. The principle of sufficient reason cannot be coherently denied, and as soon as that goes through, which I believe it does, then we are led ineluctably to the existence of a necessary reality that must transcend the universe. And in the next episode, we will look at why that necessary reality.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.